The lights on the monitoring station flickered as another transmission cut through the silence of space. Commander Vextal moved his forearms across the control panel, trying to understand what he was hearing. The sound was broken, filled with static and fear. Someone was screaming for help. Vextal had worked at the Galactic Council station for 20 years. He had heard distress calls before, but this one was different. The voice on the other end belonged to a Lyrian, and Lyrians never screamed. They were peaceful people, artists and philosophers who spent their days creating beauty and discussing the meaning of existence. The message played again. Vextal closed his eyes and listened carefully. Through the static, he could hear the words clearly now. The Lyrian colony on Exodus 7 was under attack. The Kragath Dominion had arrived with warships and warriors. They were rounding up every Lyrian on the planet, 30,000 innocent souls, and preparing to take them away as slaves. Pelman, a young officer who had just started working at the station, rushed into the command center. His face was pale with worry. He had been monitoring the outer systems when the call came through. He told Vextal that the Kragath had 7 massive warships in orbit around Exodus 7. Their ground forces were already on the surface, herding Lyrians into camps like animals. Vextal immediately contacted the Galactic Defense Coalition. He spoke with military commanders from a dozen different species. Each conversation ended the same way. The Centrillion fleet was 3 weeks away and too small to fight the Kragath. The Valorian armada was engaged in border disputes on the other side of the galaxy. The Meridian forces were designed for peacekeeping, not war. Species after species gave him the same answer. They were either too far away, too weak, or too afraid. The Kragath were not like other species. They came from a world of endless warfare, where only the strong survived. Their warriors stood 8 feet tall, covered in natural armor that could deflect most weapons. They had conquered 17 different civilizations in the last 50 years. When the Kragath attacked, entire species either submitted or died. Vextal sat at his desk and put his head in his hands. 30,000 Lyrians were going to become slaves, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The galaxy was large, and help was always too far away when you needed it most. Pelman stood quietly in the corner for a long moment. Then he spoke softly, almost afraid to say the words out loud. There was one species that might be able to help. One species that no one liked to talk about. The humans. Vextal looked up sharply. The humans had only joined the Galactic Council 5 years ago. Their planet, Earth, was classified as a death world. Most species in the galaxy evolved on peaceful planets with gentle weather and abundant food. Humans evolved on a world that was constantly trying to kill them. They survived ice ages and droughts, predators and diseases that would have wiped out any normal species. The stories about humans spread through the galaxy like wildfire. They were persistent to the point of insanity. When a human decided to do something, they would rather die than give up. Their bodies were built for a high-gravity world, making them stronger than they looked. Their immune systems could fight off diseases that would kill most aliens in hours. They healed from injuries that would be fatal to others. But what really frightened the other species was the human capacity for violence. Humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other before they unified their planet. They understood warfare in ways that peaceful species could never comprehend. When humans fought, they fought with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. Most council members preferred to keep humans at arm's length. They were useful for dangerous tasks, but no one wanted to get too close to a species that seemed to enjoy conflict. Humans were the ones you called when you needed someone who wouldn't quit, wouldn't surrender, and wouldn't stop until the job was done. Vextal thought about the Lyrian children he had seen in the colony reports. He thought about 30,000 innocent people being dragged away to a life of slavery and suffering. He thought about the fact that every other species in the galaxy was unwilling or unable to help. He told Pelman to send the message to Earth. The transmission would reach the human orbital station in less than an hour. If the humans decided to help, they could reach Exodus 7 in 3 days. If they decided not to help, then the Lyrians were doomed anyway. There was nothing left to lose. Pelman prepared the transmission. He included all the information they had about the Kragath forces, the location of the colony, and the estimated time before the Lyrians would be transported off the planet. He attached images of the Lyrian people, their culture, their art. He wanted the humans to see exactly who they would be saving. The message ended with a simple statement: 30,000 innocent lives were in danger. The Galactic Council had no one else to send. Humanity was the last hope. The transmission was sent through the faster-than-light communication network. It traveled across the vast distance between the monitoring station and Earth in seconds. Somewhere above the blue and green planet that humans called home, someone would receive the message. Someone would have to decide if humanity would answer the call. Vexthal waited. There was nothing else to do now. He watched the screen that showed the Exodus 7 system. The Kragath ships continued their blockade. On the surface, the holding camps grew larger as more Lyrians were captured. Time was running out. Pellman brought him a drink and sat down beside his commander. They both stared at the communication console, waiting for any response from Earth. The minutes stretched into an hour. Vexthal began to wonder if the humans would simply ignore the message. Maybe they had decided that this was not their problem. Maybe they were not interested in fighting the Kragath for people they had never met. Then the console beeped. A message was coming through from Earth. Vexthal opened it with trembling hands. The message was short and written in the efficient style that humans seemed to prefer. It was from someone named Admiral Jack Harrison, commander of the Terran Defense Fleet. The message said that humanity had received the distress call. They understood the situation. They were preparing a response fleet. Expected contact with the Kragath forces in 72 hours. Vexthal read the message 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. The humans were actually going to fight the Kragath. They were going to travel 3 days across space to defend people they had never met, against an enemy that terrified the entire galaxy. Pellman began sending the message to the other council members. Vexthal could already imagine their reactions. Some would be grateful. Others would be horrified. Many would question whether humanity had the authority to take military action without full council approval. But none of that mattered now. Help was coming. The humans were coming. And somewhere on Exodus 7, 30,000 Lyrians were about to discover what it meant when a Deathworld species decided to protect you. Admiral Jack Harrison stood in the command center of the Terran Gateway, staring at the message on his screen. He was 53 years old with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of military service. He had fought in the Unification Wars when Earth's nations finally came together under one banner. He had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes, and he had hoped those days were behind him. The message from the Galactic Council changed everything. Harrison read through the details carefully. A peaceful species was under attack. 30,000 civilians were about to become slaves. The Kragath Dominion was responsible, and no one else in the galaxy was willing to help. Harrison called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. Within 20 minutes, his office was filled with the best military minds humanity had to offer. Captain Lisa Morgan arrived first. She commanded the battleship Valiant Dawn and had a reputation for aggressive tactics and brilliant strategic thinking. She was in her mid-30s, always moving, always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Commander Greg Powell came in next. He was the fleet's chief strategic officer, calm and analytical where Morgan was fierce and intuitive. He already had a tablet in his hands displaying star charts and tactical assessments. He had clearly been studying the situation before the meeting even started. Harrison laid out the facts. The Lyrian colony was 3 days away at maximum slipspace velocity. The Kragath had at least 7 warships in the system, each one twice the size of human vessels. Intelligence reports suggested the Kragath were preparing to transport the Lyrians to slave markets within the week. Morgan asked the obvious question. Did they have authorization from the Council to intervene? Harrison shook his head. Earth had provisional membership status, which meant they were technically observers. They had no formal authority to conduct military operations without approval from the full Council. Getting that approval could take weeks, and the Lyrians didn't have weeks. Powell pulled up information about the Kragath military. Their warriors were bred for combat, trained from birth to fight and conquer. Their weapons technology was roughly equivalent to human technology, but their ships were larger and more heavily armored. A direct confrontation would be difficult and costly. Harrison walked to the window and looked down at Earth. The blue planet turned slowly below him, peaceful and beautiful. He thought about the people down there going about their lives, unaware that their military was about to make a decision that would change humanity's place in the galaxy. He had joined the military to protect people. That was the whole point. When someone called for help, you answered. It didn't matter if they were human or alien. It didn't matter if you had permission from some council. 30,000 innocent people were about to suffer, and Earth had the power to stop it. Harrison turned back to his officers and gave the order. They would deploy a rapid response fleet immediately. 5 destroyers for speed and firepower, 2 heavy cruisers for staying power. The Valiant Dawn would serve as the flagship. They would be ready to launch within 6 hours. Morgan smiled. This was why she had joined the fleet. Powell nodded and began calculating supply requirements and battle formations. Within minutes, the command center was buzzing with activity. The order went out across the Terran Gateway and to the military stations scattered throughout Earth's solar system. Ship captains received their deployment notices. Marine commanders began assembling their units. Engineers started pre-flight checks on every vessel in the response fleet. Lieutenant Danny Cooper was in the Marine barracks when the call came through. He was 24 years old from a small town in Texas, and he had joined the Marines because he wanted to see the galaxy. Now he was going to see combat against an alien enemy that no one in the galaxy wanted to fight. Danny sat down and recorded a message to his family. He told them he was being deployed to help some people who needed it. He didn't mention the Kragath or the danger. He just said that this was what he had trained for and he was proud to serve. His hands were steady as he recorded the message, but his heart was pounding. All across the fleet, similar scenes played out. Pilots checked their fighters and bombers, making sure every system was perfect. Weapons officers loaded railgun ammunition and missiles. Medical teams prepared trauma centers and emergency surgery rooms. Everyone knew what was coming. In the hangar bay of the Valiant Dawn, Captain Morgan walked among her crew. She stopped to talk with young ensigns and veteran sergeants alike. She reminded them why they were going. Not because some council told them to, not because of politics or territory. They were going because people needed help, and humanity had never been good at walking away from people in trouble. Commander Powell worked with the navigation team to plot the fastest route to the Exodus 7 system. They would push the engines hard, traveling at the maximum safe speed. 3 days to cover a distance that would take most species a week. Human slip space technology was newer than most galactic civilizations, but it was fast and efficient. Harrison sent a final message to the Galactic Council. It was brief and professional. Humanity had received the distress call. They were responding. The Council would be informed of the results. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't apologize for acting without authorization. He simply stated what was going to happen. The message reached the council chambers on Meridian Prime in seconds. Commander Vexthal watched as the other representatives reacted. Some were grateful that someone was finally taking action. Others were shocked that the humans would dare move without approval. A few were terrified, realizing that humanity was more militarily capable than anyone had estimated. One representative from the Valorian Collective stood up and demanded that the humans be ordered to stand down. This was not their fight. They had no authority. Vexthal listened to the debate with growing frustration. These people were arguing about procedure while Lyrians were being enslaved. Back at the Terran Gateway, the fleet was almost ready. Ships detached from docking stations and moved into formation. The Valiant Dawn took the lead position, her armor gleaming under the distant sun. Destroyers flanked her on both sides. Cruisers formed the rear guard. Harrison stood on the observation deck and watched the fleet assemble. It was not the largest force humanity could field, but it was fast and deadly. More importantly, every person in that fleet was there by choice. They had all volunteered for this mission, knowing they might not come back. The final countdown began. Engineers confirmed that all ships were ready. Navigation confirmed the jump coordinates. Weapon systems showed green across the board. Medical teams reported ready status. Morgan stood on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn, her hands resting on the command console. She looked at the faces of her crew, seeing determination and courage in equal measure. They were about to jump into a situation where they were outnumbered and outgunned. They were going to fight an enemy that had never been defeated, and they were going to do it for people they had never met. The order came from Harrison. All ships, prepare to jump. The fleet vanished from Earth's solar system in a flash of blue light, racing across the galaxy toward Exodus 7. Behind them, Earth continued turning. unaware that its children were about to announce humanity's presence to the galaxy in the most dramatic way possible. And on Exodus 7, 30,000 Lyrians huddled in camps, not knowing that help was coming from a species they had never heard of. The Deathworlders were on their way. The human fleet dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the Exodus 7 system. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the sensors came alive with warnings. 7 Kragath warships appeared on the tactical display, massive and threatening. They formed a blockade around the planet. Their weapons pointed toward the surface where the Lyrian colonists were trapped. Captain Lisa Morgan stood on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn, watching the display with calm eyes. She had studied the Kragath on the 3-day journey to this system. She knew their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses. Now it was time to put that knowledge to use. The Kragath detected the human fleet immediately. A transmission came through, audio only. The voice that spoke was deep and rough, filled with arrogance and confidence. It belonged to Warlord Draxus, commander of the Kragath forces. He demanded to know who dared enter his territory. Morgan opened the channel but didn't respond to his question. Instead, she gave him a simple order. Release the Lyrians and leave the system. The Kragath warlord laughed. It was a harsh, mocking sound. He told Morgan that humans were unknown to him, but they were clearly foolish. 7 warships against a small fleet. There was no contest. He ordered the humans to leave or be destroyed. Morgan closed the channel without another word. She looked at her tactical officer and gave a single command. Execute attack pattern Alpha. The human fleet split into 3 groups and began moving at speeds that shocked the Kragath. Human ships were smaller than the massive Kragath vessels, but they were fast and agile. The destroyers spread out, surrounding the enemy formation from multiple angles. The cruisers held back, weapons charging. Commander Greg Powell coordinated the attack from the tactical center deep in the Valiant Dawn. His screens showed dozens of data points, trajectories, power levels, and weapon ranges. He spoke calmly into his headset, directing each ship to its assigned position. Years of training and hundreds of simulations had prepared him for this moment. The first shots came from the human destroyers. Railguns fired projectiles that moved at incredible speeds, crossing the distance between ships in seconds. The rounds slammed into Kragath shields, creating brilliant flashes of energy. The shields held, but the impacts made the massive ships shudder. Warlord Draxus ordered his ships to return fire. Plasma cannons erupted across the Kragath vessels, sending superheated bolts toward the human fleet. But the human ships were already moving, dodging and weaving through space with precision that seemed impossible for vessels of their size. One plasma bolt caught a human destroyer on its port side. The ship's shields absorbed most of the impact, but the armor underneath glowed red-hot. Damage reports flooded into the command center. The destroyer's captain reported minor damage and maintained formation. The ship kept fighting. Morgan watched the battle unfold with intense focus. The Kragath ships were powerful, but they were designed for overwhelming force, not precision combat. They expected enemies to stand still and trade shots until one side broke. Humans fought differently. She ordered the fighter squadrons to launch. Hundreds of small craft poured out of the carriers, filling the space around the Kragath warships like a swarm of angry insects. Each fighter was piloted by a human who had trained for years for this moment. Lieutenant Amy Chen led her squadron in a diving attack run toward the nearest Kragath cruiser. Her fighter screamed through space, dodging defensive fire with movements that would have knocked out most species. Humans could handle higher G-forces than almost any other known species. Their Deathworld bodies were built for it. Amy's squadron targeted the shield generators on the Kragath cruiser. Their missiles struck in perfect sequence, overwhelming the defensive systems. The shields flickered and died. For a brief moment, the massive warship was vulnerable. Commander Powell saw the opening immediately. He ordered 2 destroyers to concentrate fire on the exposed cruiser. Railgun rounds tore into the ship's hull, punching through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. Atmosphere vented into space. Internal explosions rippled across the vessel. Warlord Draxus watched in growing anger as his ship struggled against these unknown humans. He couldn't understand how they moved so fast, how they coordinated so perfectly. Every Kragath commander had decades of combat experience. But these humans fought like they had been born for war. He was not entirely wrong. Humans had spent millennia fighting each other before they reached the stars. They understood war in ways that peaceful species could never grasp. Every tactic, every strategy, Every trick had been learned through blood and survival. Morgan saw two Kragath destroyers moving to flank the Valiant Dawn. Instead of retreating, she did something that should have been suicide. She ordered her ship to charge directly between them, straight into the crossfire. The tactical officer looked at her in shock, but Morgan's face was calm. She knew exactly what she was doing. The Valiant Dawn accelerated toward the gap between the two enemy ships. Plasma fire hammered the human battleship from both sides. Shields flared and collapsed. Armor began to glow and melt, but the Valiant Dawn kept going. And as she passed between the two Kragath vessels, her weapons fired at point-blank range. Missiles and railgun rounds slammed into both enemy ships simultaneously. At this distance, shields meant nothing. The damage was catastrophic. One Kragath destroyer lost power to its engines and began drifting. The other took a direct hit to its bridge. The entire command section exploded, and the ship went dark. On the surface of Exodus 7, Marine Commander Sam Rodriguez was preparing for his part of the operation. 200 Marines sat in drop pods wearing powered armor that made them look like metal giants. They had been waiting for the signal, watching the space battle through external cameras. Rodriguez gave the order. The drop pods launched from their carriers and plunged toward the planet below. The pods heated up as they hit the atmosphere, glowing red like falling stars. Inside, the Marines checked their weapons one final time. The pods slammed into the ground near the largest Lyrian holding camp. Doors blew open with explosive charges and the Marines poured out. The Kragath ground forces turned to face this new threat, raising their weapons. What they saw confused them. These humans were small compared to Kragath warriors, barely 6 feet tall. But they moved in their powered armor like hunters, fast and coordinated. And when the first shots were fired, the Kragath learned a hard lesson. Humans knew how to fight on the ground. They had been doing it for thousands of years. Every Marine had trained in dozens of different combat scenarios. They knew how to use cover, how to flank, how to strike hard and fast. Lieutenant Danny Cooper was at the front of the charge. He saw a Kragath warrior raising a weapon toward a group of Lyrian civilians. Danny's rifle came up in a smooth motion and he fired. The round crossed 200 meters in an instant and struck the Kragath warrior in the head. The alien fell without making a sound. The Marines spread out across the camp, engaging Kragath forces wherever they found them. The battle was fierce but one-sided. The Kragath had expected easy victims, not trained soldiers in powered armor who refused to stop advancing. Rodriguez led a squad toward the camp's command center. A Kragath officer stood in the doorway, holding a weapon to a Lyrian child's head. The officer shouted that the humans should surrender or the child would die. Rodriguez didn't negotiate. His rifle was already aimed. He fired once and the Kragath officer collapsed. The Lyrian child ran to safety, crying but alive. Above in orbit, the space battle continued. 3 Kragath ships were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 4 were beginning to realize they were losing. This should not have been possible. The Kragath had never lost before. They had conquered 17 species. They were the strongest warriors in the galaxy, but they had never fought humans before. And humans had one quality that terrified every species that encountered them. They absolutely refused to quit. The Valiant Dawn shook as another plasma bolt struck her forward shields. Captain Lisa Morgan gripped the command console and watched the damage report scroll across her screen. 3 decks had lost atmosphere. The port weapons array was offline. Casualties were mounting in the engineering section, but Morgan didn't consider retreating. She had seen the Lyrian children in the intelligence reports. She had read about their peaceful culture, their art, their philosophy. Those people were depending on humanity to save them. Retreat was not an option. Warlord Draxus realized he was facing an enemy unlike any he had encountered before. His remaining 4 warships focused all their fire on the human flagship. If he could destroy their command ship, perhaps the others would flee. It was a reasonable tactical assumption. Most species broke when their leader fell. Humans were not most species. The concentrated fire hammered the Valiant Dawn mercilessly. Shields collapsed under the sustained barrage. Armor began to melt and peel away. Internal explosions rocked the ship as power conduits overloaded. Morgan ordered all non-essential crew to the emergency shelters, but she and her bridge crew remained at their posts. Admiral Jack Harrison watched the battle from the Terran Gateway, millions of miles away. He saw the valiant Dawn taking devastating damage. He prepared the order for a tactical withdrawal. Better to lose the battle than lose the entire fleet. Then something happened that no one expected. The Lyrians fought back. On the surface of Exodus 7, the rescued colonists did not run to safety. Instead, they picked up tools, rocks, anything they could use as weapons. They turned on their Kragath captors with a fury born from days of fear and humiliation. The peaceful philosophers became desperate defenders of their home. Lyrian engineers sabotaged Kragath vehicles, causing explosions that destroyed entire transport columns. Lyrian workers created barricades to help the human marines. They threw themselves at armed warriors with nothing but improvised weapons and pure determination. They had seen humanity risk everything to save them. They would not stand idle while their rescuers died. Lieutenant Danny Cooper watched a Lyrian elder, too old to fight effectively, throw himself at a Kragath warrior to protect a group of children. The old Lyrian was struck down, but the moment of distraction allowed Danny to take the shot. The warrior fell and the children escaped. Danny helped the injured elder to his feet. The old Lyrian looked at him with tears streaming down his face and spoke in broken universal language. He thanked the humans for reminding his people what courage looked like. In orbit, Commander Greg Powell saw an opportunity. One of the damaged Kragath cruisers had lost power to its engines. The massive ship was drifting, unable to maneuver. Powell contacted the captain of the destroyer Freedom's Call and issued a series of rapid commands. The Freedom's Call turned toward the crippled Kragath vessel and accelerated to maximum speed. The destroyer's captain understood immediately what Powell wanted. It was a dangerous maneuver, one that required perfect timing and nerves of steel. The destroyer raced toward the enemy ship like a missile. At the last possible moment, the Freedom's Call released every torpedo it had at point-blank range. The spread of 20 warheads struck the Kragath cruiser's hull in a perfectly timed sequence. The destroyer veered away, engines screaming with the strain. The explosions were catastrophic. The Kragath cruiser broke apart in a series of secondary detonations. Debris scattered across the battlefield and chunks of burning metal struck 2 other enemy ships. One Kragath destroyer lost its shields completely. Another took damage to its weapon systems. Warlord Draxus felt something he had never experienced in his long military career. Doubt. These humans should have broken by now. Their flagship was crippled. They were outnumbered, yet they kept fighting with an intensity that defied all logic. He watched on his screens as human boarding parties breached the hull of his own flagship, the Crimson Fang. Marines in powered armor poured through the breach, moving through the corridors with terrifying efficiency. They engaged his warriors in close combat, and the results shocked him. Kragath warriors were larger and stronger than humans. In hand-to-hand combat, they should have dominated. But the human-powered armor evened the physical advantages, and the humans fought with a viciousness that seemed to come from somewhere primal and dark. Danny Cooper was part of the boarding team that entered the Crimson Fang. His squad moved through the ship's corridors, clearing room after room. They encountered heavy resistance near a command center. A dozen Kragath warriors defended the position with plasma rifles and grenades. Danny didn't wait for a careful plan. He charged forward, drawing the enemy fire. Plasma bolts burned through his armor's shields and scorched the metal underneath. He felt the heat searing his skin, smelled his own flesh burning. But he kept moving, kept firing, kept advancing. His squad mates used the distraction to flank the Kragath position. Within seconds, the battle was over. Danny collapsed against a wall, his armor displaying critical damage warnings. The medic rushed to his side, but Danny waved him off. They had a job to finish. On the bridge of the Valiant Dawn, Captain Morgan received a damage report that should have ended the fight. Main power was at 30%. Shields were gone. Weapons were limited to 50% capacity. Life support was failing on 6 decks. Morgan looked at her tactical officer and asked a simple question. Could they still fight? The officer nodded. The ship was badly damaged, but she wasn't dead yet. Morgan smiled grimly and ordered all remaining weapons to target the nearest Kragath vessel. The crippled human flagship unleashed everything she had left. Railgun rounds and missiles streaked across space, slamming into the Kragath destroyer with concentrated fury. The enemy ship's shields flickered and failed. Armor cracked and split. Atmosphere vented into the void. Warlord Draxus watched his fleet crumbling around him. 3 ships destroyed, 2 heavily damaged, and these humans showed no sign of stopping. He thought about his career. about the 17 species he had conquered. None of them had fought like this. None of them had been willing to die rather than surrender. He opened a direct communication channel to the human flagship. Captain Morgan's face appeared on his screen. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, her uniform torn and stained, but her eyes were clear and determined. Draxus spoke in the universal language that all species used for communication. He told Morgan that he had never seen warriors like her people. He asked what drove them to fight so hard for strangers. Why would they die for people they had never met? Morgan's answer was simple and direct. Because someone needed help. Because it was the right thing to do. Because humanity had learned a long time ago that the strong have a responsibility to protect the weak. Draxus stared at her in silence. In his culture, strength was used to dominate. The weak served the strong. That was the natural order. But these humans believed something different. They used their strength to protect others. For the first time in his life, Warlord Draxus questioned everything he had been taught. Morgan gave him one final chance. She told him to withdraw his forces and leave the system. The Lyrians were under human protection now. If the Kragath stayed, they would all die. She said it calmly, without anger or hatred. It was simply a statement of fact. Draxus looked at his tactical display. His fleet was shattered. The humans were damaged but still fighting. And on the surface, his ground forces were being overrun by a combination of human marines and enraged Lyrians. He had two choices. He could continue fighting and lose everything, including his life. Or he could retreat and live to fight another day. For a warrior who had never retreated in his entire career, the decision was agony. But Warlord Draxus was also a practical commander. He had lost this battle. There was no shame in admitting defeat to an enemy this capable. He gave the order. All Kragath ships were to disengage and retreat from the system. Ground forces were ordered to surrender to human command. The Kragath fleet turned and began moving toward the system's edge. Within minutes, they vanished into slipspace, leaving behind their warriors and their pride. The Battle of Exodus 7 was over. Humanity had won. The silence after the battle was profound. For several minutes, no one on the human ship spoke. They had won, but the cost had been high. The Valiant Dawn drifted in orbit, her engines offline, her hull scarred and burned. 2 destroyers had taken critical damage. 17 humans had died in the fighting, with dozens more wounded. Captain Lisa Morgan sat in her command chair, looking at the casualty reports. Each name on that list represented someone who had volunteered for this mission, someone who had chosen to risk everything to save people they had never met. She would remember every single name for the rest of her life. On the surface of Exodus 7, Marine Commander Sam Rodriguez supervised the surrender of the Kragath ground forces. The alien warriors knelt in rows, their weapons piled nearby. They looked confused and shocked. Many of them had never surrendered before. The concept was foreign to their culture. Rodriguez walked among them, checking that the prisoners were being treated properly. Some of his Marines wanted revenge for their fallen comrades. Rodriguez understood the feeling, but he wouldn't allow it. The fighting was over. These Kragath had surrendered, which made them prisoners deserving of proper treatment under human military law. One captured Kragath warrior asked Rodriguez why the humans were helping them. They were enemies. They had tried to enslave the Lyrians. Why weren't the humans executing them? Rodriguez explained that humans fought when necessary, but they didn't believe in killing helpless prisoners. Just because someone was your enemy in battle didn't mean you let them die when the battle was over. The Kragath warrior seemed unable to comprehend this idea. The Lyrian colonists emerged from hiding as the last Kragath forces were secured. 30,000 people slowly came out of buildings and shelters, looking at the sky where human ships drifted in orbit. They had been saved. The nightmare was over. Elder Tomlas, the leader of the Lyrian colony, approached the human command post that Rodriguez had established. The old Lyrian was crying, overwhelmed by emotion. He had thought his people were doomed. He had watched children being dragged away to camps. He had prepared himself for a life of slavery. Instead, strangers from across the galaxy had come to save them, strangers who fought and bled and died to protect people they had never met. Tomlas knelt before Rodriguez and tried to express his gratitude in broken universal language. Rodriguez helped him stand. He told the elder that humans didn't require gratitude. They had done what needed to be done. Anyone would have done the same, but Tomlas shook his head. No one else had done the same. The entire Galactic Council had refused to help. Dozens of species had turned away. Only humanity had answered the call. Lieutenant Danny Cooper sat in a medical tent receiving treatment for his burns. The pain was intense, but he was alive. He watched medics treating both human Marines and captured Kragath warriors side by side. The human doctors didn't care that the Kragath had been trying to kill them an hour ago. A wounded person needed help, and that was all that mattered. A Kragath prisoner in the next bed stared at Danny in confusion. The alien asked why the humans were healing their enemies. Danny thought about it for a moment, then gave the only answer that made sense to him. Just because they fought didn't mean they wanted anyone to suffer. Above the planet, repair crews worked frantically on the damaged ships. The Valiant Dawn needed extensive repairs before she could jump back to Earth. Engineers sealed hull breaches, rerouted power systems, and cleared debris from the corridors. It would take days before the ship was spaceworthy again. Captain Morgan walked through the damaged sections, talking to her crew. She thanked them for their courage and their sacrifice. Many of them were exhausted, covered in soot and blood, but they smiled when they saw her. They had done the impossible. They had defeated the Kragath. Commander Greg Powell sent detailed reports back to Admiral Harrison and the Terran Gateway. The reports included tactical analysis, casualty figures, and damage assessments. But they also included something else: stories of Lyrian civilians fighting alongside human Marines, accounts of enemies becoming prisoners who questioned everything they believed, evidence that humanity's actions had changed more than just this one battle. Back at the Galactic Council headquarters on Meridian Prime, Commander Vexthal watched the reports coming in from Exodus 7. The humans had won, against all odds, against an enemy that had never been defeated. The Deathworlders had rescued the Lyrians. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species argued about what humanity's victory meant. Some praised Earth for taking action when no one else would. Others complained that humans had overstepped their authority. A few were openly terrified, realizing that humanity possessed military power far beyond what anyone had estimated. One representative from the Valorian Collective stood and demanded sanctions against Earth. Humans had no right to conduct military operations without council approval. They had violated protocols. They should be expelled from the council entirely. Vexthal listened to the arguments with growing frustration. He stood slowly, his forearms raised for attention. The chamber quieted. Vexthal spoke clearly and firmly. The council had received a distress call from innocent people. The council had done nothing. Humanity had done what the council refused to do. He asked the representatives a simple question. What exactly should humanity have done? Watched while 30,000 Lyrians were enslaved? Waited for council approval that might take weeks? Let innocent people suffer because of bureaucratic procedures? The chamber fell silent. No one had a good answer. Then the doors opened and Elder Tomlas entered. He had traveled from Exodus 7 specifically for this moment. He moved slowly to the center of the chamber, looking at the representatives of species that had refused to help his people. Tomlas spoke in a voice that shook with emotion. He described watching Kragath warriors drag Lyrian children from their homes. He talked about the camps, the fear, the certainty that his people were doomed. He spoke of human Marines shielding Lyrian civilians with their own bodies, of human pilots flying into overwhelming fire to protect the colony, of human doctors treating everyone, friend and enemy alike. He said that humanity had shown his people what true strength looked like. Strength wasn't about conquering others. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. One by one, other voices joined his. Representatives from species that had remained neutral in galactic politics suddenly spoke up. The Meridian Accord, a coalition of peaceful civilizations, formally requested that humanity be granted full council membership. They also invited Earth to join their mutual defense pact. The proposal was put to a vote. The chamber divided sharply. Some species voted enthusiastically for humanity's inclusion. Others voted against it out of fear or political calculation. When the votes were counted, the result was clear. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Council. Earth was no longer a provisional member. They were full partners in the galactic community, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with that status. On Earth, the news spread rapidly. Billions of people watched footage of the battle, of Marines storming Kragath positions, of ships standing against impossible odds. The names of the fallen were read on every news channel. Captain Morgan, Commander Powell, and Lieutenant Cooper became heroes overnight. But in the quiet moments, away from the celebrations and media attention, the survivors of Exodus 7 gathered in the chapel aboard the Valiant Dawn. Captain Morgan stood before the memorial wall where 17 names had been added. She read each name aloud, remembering the people behind them. She told them that they were being called heroes. But heroism wasn't about glory or fame. It was about doing what was right when no one else would. It was about standing up for people who couldn't stand for themselves. That was what they had done. That was what humanity would always do. The memorial service ended quietly. The crew dispersed, returning to their duties. The work of repairing the ship and caring for the wounded continued. But something had changed in the galaxy. Humanity had announced its presence not with grand speeches or diplomatic maneuvering, but with action. They had shown every species what Deathworlders were capable of when someone they cared about was threatened. And across the galaxy, both the innocent and the cruel began to understand what that meant. 3 weeks after the Battle of Exodus 7, the human fleet limped back into Earth's solar system. The ships were scarred and damaged, but they were intact. More importantly, every human who had survived the battle was coming home. The Terran Gateway prepared a reception unlike anything in Earth's history. Millions watched on screens around the world as the battered fleet approached. The Valiant Dawn led the formation, her hull still showing the burns and impacts from the battle. She looked like she had been through hell. She had. Admiral Jack Harrison stood at the docking bay, waiting to greet Captain Lisa Morgan and her crew. When the airlock opened and Morgan stepped through, the entire station erupted in applause. She looked embarrassed by the attention, but Harrison saluted her formally. He told her that she and her crew had changed everything. Humanity was no longer an unknown species on the edges of galactic civilization. They were now recognized as protectors, as warriors, as people who would stand up for the innocent. Morgan accepted the praise on behalf of her crew, but she made sure everyone knew the real heroes were the 17 who didn't come home. Their sacrifice had saved 30,000 lives. That was what mattered. Lieutenant Danny Cooper returned home to Texas to recover from his injuries. His burns were healing slowly, but the doctors said he would make a full recovery. His hometown threw a parade in his honor. Danny stood on a stage and looked at the crowd, feeling uncomfortable with all the attention. When someone asked him if he was scared during the battle, Danny answered honestly. He had been terrified. But fear didn't matter when people needed help. You pushed through the fear and did what needed to be done. A young boy in the crowd asked Danny why he had fought for people he didn't know. Danny knelt down to the boy's level and explained that humans had always been this way. Throughout their history, there had always been people willing to risk everything to protect others. It was part of who they were as a species. The boy asked if Danny would do it again. Danny smiled and nodded. Every single time someone needed help, he would be there. At the Galactic Council headquarters on Meridian Prime, the political landscape was shifting rapidly. Humanity's victory over the Kragath had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Species that had been neutral or hostile to Earth suddenly wanted to establish diplomatic relations. Trade agreements were being negotiated. Cultural exchanges were being planned. But more importantly, the innocent species of the galaxy had a new protector. The Lyrians spread the story of their rescue to anyone who would listen. Other species that had suffered under the Kragath dominion began reaching out to Earth, asking for help, for protection, for hope. Commander Vexthal met with human diplomats regularly. He had been right to send that first distress call to Earth. Humanity had proven themselves to be exactly what the galaxy needed. Not conquerors or empire builders, but defenders, warriors who would fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The Kragath dominion, meanwhile, was in chaos. Warlord Draxus had returned home in disgrace. His defeat at the hands of an unknown species had shaken the entire Kragath military structure. For the first time in their history, they had encountered a species more dangerous than themselves. Some Kragath leaders wanted revenge. They called for a massive military campaign against Earth, but wiser voices prevailed. The humans had shown mercy to captured warriors. They had treated prisoners with dignity. They had fought fiercely but fairly. Draxus himself spoke before the Kragath War Council. He described the humans not as enemies to be destroyed, but as warriors to be respected. He told them about human Marines who died protecting Lyrian children, about human doctors who healed enemy wounded, about a species that measured strength not by what they could take, but by what they could protect. The Kragath had spent centuries believing that might made right, that the strong should dominate the weak. Humanity had shown them a different path. It would take time for the Kragath to change, but the seed had been planted. On Exodus 7, the Lyrian colony was rebuilding. Human engineers had stayed behind to help repair the damage from the battle. Human Marines trained Lyrian security forces to defend themselves. Human teachers shared knowledge and technology. Elder Tomless walked through the colony watching his people laugh and sing again. Children played in the streets. Artists painted murals depicting the battle, showing human ships descending from the sky like avenging angels. Philosophers wrote new texts about courage and sacrifice. The Lyrians would never forget what humanity had done for them. They built a monument in the center of their capital city. It showed a human Marine holding a Lyrian child, surrounded by the names of the 17 humans who had died saving them. The inscription read simply, "They came when no one else would." Captain Morgan stood on the observation deck of the newly repaired Valiant Dawn, looking at Earth turning slowly below. The planet was beautiful, covered in blue oceans and green continents. It was a harsh world by galactic standards, a death world that had shaped humanity into what they were. Commander Powell joined her at the window. He asked if she had any regrets about the battle. Morgan shook her head. They had saved 30,000 lives. 17 humans had died, but their sacrifice had meaning. They had shown the galaxy what humanity stood for. Powell mentioned that dozens of distress calls were coming in from across the galaxy. Species that had been victimized by pirates, raiders, and oppressors were calling for help. They were asking specifically for humans, the Deathworlders who wouldn't quit. Morgan smiled. The Terran defense fleet would need to expand. More ships, more crews, more warriors willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. It would be a long road, full of danger and sacrifice. But that was what humans did. They protected those who couldn't protect themselves. It was part of their nature, written into their DNA by millions of years of evolution on a harsh world that demanded cooperation and courage. Admiral Harrison issued a statement to the people of Earth. He explained that their role in the galaxy was changing. They were no longer just another species trying to find their place. They were protectors now, defenders of the innocent, warriors for those who had no warriors of their own. He called for volunteers to join the expanding fleet. The response was overwhelming. Millions of people applied to serve. They wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. They wanted to make a difference in the galaxy. Training facilities were built on Earth and throughout the solar system. New ships were constructed in orbital shipyards. Marines, pilots, engineers, and medics prepared for missions across the galaxy. Humanity was mobilizing not for conquest but for protection. Lieutenant Amy Chen, who had led the fighter attack on the Kragath cruiser, became an instructor at the new pilot training academy. She taught young pilots about courage and sacrifice, about fighting for something larger than yourself, about the responsibility that came with being a Deathworlder. She told them that humans were dangerous when threatened, but they were even more dangerous when someone they cared about was in danger. That was the secret that the galaxy was learning. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their weapons or their ships. It was their willingness to fight and die for others. The distress call that started everything, the call from Exodus 7, stopped broadcasting. It was replaced by a new message that spread through every communication network in the galaxy. The message was simple but powerful. They came, the humans came, and throughout the galaxy, species both innocent and cruel began to understand what that meant. When someone called for help, humanity would answer. When someone threatened the innocent, humanity would respond. When someone thought they could prey on the weak without consequence, they would learn about the Deathworlders from Earth. The age of humanity had begun. Not an age of conquest or empire, but an age of protection and justice. An age where strength was used to defend rather than dominate. An age where the strong stood up for the weak. On the bridge of the Valiant Dawn, Captain Morgan received notification of their next mission. Another distress call, another species in trouble, another chance to make a difference. She called her crew to battle stations and felt them respond with the same determination they had shown at Exodus 7. The ship turned away from Earth and accelerated toward the jump point. There were people out there who needed help, and humanity had never been good at walking away from people in trouble. As the Valiant Dawn vanished into slip space, a transmission was sent back to Earth. It contained 3 simple words that would become humanity's motto, their promise to the galaxy, their declaration of purpose. We are coming.